Hey guys, Sam here from Chalice and Chains. I just want to start off this video by saying that I am not driving. I am in a parked car. So anyone who might be concerned about that, no need to be. That out of the way, I wanted to do another video on Fate and how to interact with some of the mechanics in Fate. Because I think that a lot of the criticisms that I see when it comes to running or playing a game of Fate revolve around the aspects and about how players basically try to BS the GM into allowing them to justify an aspect in their role, right? And some people don't like that. I've seen a lot of the times where people, they're used to very sort of defined systems, right? Where maybe it's like D&D or something where like your abilities are your abilities. They do what they do. There's really no nuance there. And getting creative with them can sometimes be hard because everything is laid out in a rule, right? But Fate isn't like that. Because aspects are essentially sentences, there's a lot of interpretation involved in that, okay? And so I think that I want to address the idea that it's somehow a problem or it's somehow a negative thing, a design flaw, if you want to call it, of Fate, that players basically try to justify their aspects to the GM, which is, in my opinion, what you're supposed to do with your aspects. So let me extrapolate on that a little bit more. With aspects, because they're sentences, by their very definition, they cannot be, you don't want them to be so broad as to, they can accommodate anything, but you also don't want them to be so narrow that you can only use them in a very, very specific circumstance, right? So what that means is that there is going to be a certain level of interpretation and justification needed to allow for those invokes and compels, right? Because, and so for example, this came up in one of my game, the game that I was playing in the other day, where one of the character's aspects was I crumble under pressure. And so I suggested as a player that, we were in a tense situation, maybe the GM could compel the aspect so that the character wouldn't act in this case or whatever. And the player actually said, oh, that's not the way I was looking at crumbles under pressure. The way I meant it was blah, 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 right? And so we went with it because the player who wrote that aspect had an expectation of what that meant that was different from our own, okay? And to me, that is part of the game of Fate. Now, I think that this is a bigger deal in, in one-shots than it is in campaign play, because in a one-shot, you don't have time necessarily to go over the characters. You haven't necessarily done what do they call it? The Fate Fractal, I think, where, you go through and you do your high concept and your trouble, and then you tie in the other three aspects to parts of an adventure involving the other characters, right? Like that kind of stuff really creates a cohesive team in which you have the opportunity to look at those aspects and kind of define them through gameplay and through character creation, right? But in a one-shot, you don't. A lot of the time, people just come to the table with a character, right? And so the GM kind of has to just write down all these aspects and see what he can do, right? So I think that in that case, a certain level of justification and interpretation is necessary and makes sense, right? But I also think that it's okay to say, as the GM, that doesn't make sense logically, right? Like based on the story that the genre and the storyline that we're playing, this doesn't make sense. Like if it's very clear that the player is trying to force an aspect to work for them, you as the GM don't need to complain about that. You don't need to say, oh, players do this, they try to just, like, no, that doesn't make sense in this situation logically. You know that, player X. Don't, be smart about this, right? I will also suggest that most people who are serious about playing Fate aren't going to do that a lot. That may happen once or twice, especially if the people don't really know how to play Fate, and it could be sort of an innocent, whatever. But it's also, I think sometimes you see this from people who are used to playing games with well-defined characteristics or attributes or feats or whatever, where they have a very clear linear definition of what they do. And when you don't have that in Fate, people can get freaked out by that. They don't know what to do, and so sometimes they start forcing, or they try to start forcing something to work for them, and game masters can get frustrated with that. So anyway, I would say that in terms of players trying to, bullshit the GM into allowing them to use an aspect, I would look at that very carefully and decide whether or not that is if that's just that player trying to do that. If the GM is a pushover and therefore allows that, and so the players notice that and they try to abuse that, or if it is just not trying to BS the GM, but trying to look at an interpretation of this aspect and try to flesh that out. And the point of Fate is that it's a cooperative game, so you guys can work together to determine whether or not that stuff makes sense. So let me know your thoughts. Again, I'm not an expert on Fate by any means, but I would certainly love to get people's feedback on this and let me know what their experiences have been. So, like, subscribe, do the whole thing, and happy gaming.